Hi, everyone. My name is Joy Burwell. I'm AOPA's Director of Communication and Membership, and wanted to just take a minute to welcome everybody to our 2023 Compliance and Ethics Weeks that we are hosting with Kelly Guys Consulting, Mosen Solutions, and OMP Insight, and we're really grateful for their support and expertise that they'll be providing over the next 5 days. What we're going to do is going to just kind of get right into the content. So I'm going to go ahead and say that we have 30 minutes of content. We hope to get to your questions. If not, we will, if you put them in the chat, we will get to them after and send them. We are recording this, and the recordings will be available post at the end of the week. We'll send out all the recordings to all the participants. So with that, I'm going to introduce Michelle Wilstein. She joined OMP Insult as a consultant specializing in Medicare compliance for orthotics and prosthetics. Her experience began in 2006 with Nerdian Healthcare Solutions. She worked under both Part B physicians and DME Medicare contractors. Michelle served as one of the DME team's OMP specialists, working closely with OMP suppliers and medical review nurses to understand the intricate balance between Medicare compliance while operating an OMP business in today's world. She understands that OMP suppliers have a unique set of challenges they face compared to traditional DME suppliers, and she finds great joy in helping businesses overcome these challenges to be successful. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining our Compliance and Ethics Week. We think compliance is so incredibly important, and that's primarily what we're going to be talking about today. We are going to focus on fraud, waste, and abuse, but we're also going to talk about why ethics and compliance are so important. They really they set the stage for how you're going to operate, how you're going to interact with your patients, how you're going to interact with clients, with referral sources, with payers, and it really kind of sets an environment for your entire workforce in regards to how you're going to conduct business, how you're going to operate, and the reflection that will provide to the rest of the industry on your company. So let's get started. Like I mentioned, we're going to talk about what exactly compliance and ethics means, and that may vary from one company to another. So it's really about sitting down with your staff, with your leadership team, and determining what compliance and ethics mean to you as a company, and how that's going to translate in just day-to-day workflow and how you operate. Then what we're going to get into is actually identifying, knowing the difference between fraud, waste, and abuse, and particularly how that can look in your own practice or in the interactions that you have on a daily basis. Again, working with referral sources, with patients, and more importantly, when you identify those things, going about and reporting it, because that's the best way to get those things to stop, is by reporting it so that research can happen and necessary actions can be taken to stop it in its tracks. Because ultimately, full compliance across the industry benefits everybody. And so we want to make sure that we are doing everything that we can for our own part, not just within our own company, but what we see in the industry as a whole. So first up, let's talk about what exactly compliance and ethics mean. Again, like I mentioned, this might vary from company to company. Compliance in itself is basically just adherence to rules, laws, regulations, and that can go across a whole wide spectrum of things. It's not just payer rules and regulations. It's state and federal rules and regulations. It's all of the different payers that you adhere to. It's your, building code regulations if you're leasing or you own your own building. It could be OSHA regulations and how you interact with your staff and how you treat your staff and the environment within which they work. There are so many different aspects to compliance and the ways in which we have to follow those different sets of rules and regulations and guidelines. And so it's important to not only recognize what rules and regulations apply to us as an individual company, but what we're going to do to maintain that compliance, to follow those rules, what that's going to look like for your company, and how you're going to keep track of that, keep up on the ever-changing landscape of compliance making sure that you're current and up to date on new and changing laws and regulations and things like that. Now, the best way to do it is to develop a compliance program, to have a designated individual, a compliance officer, if you will, or maybe even a work group within your company comprised of owners, management, clinicians, even billing or administrative staff, a whole work group whose sole responsibility is knowing what rules and regulations your company needs to follow and what types of processes you're going to employ internally to make sure that all of your staff is compliant with those rules and regulations. And ultimately, this isn't just about following the rules, but it's about protecting the company, protecting your staff, and protecting your patients, making sure that they are all operating within a safe environment, that they know that they're not only are their needs going to be met, but they're going to be protected in the process. And what this ultimately does is it creates a culture of trust and accountability. Your staff will feel comfortable coming to management with concerns or issues, and your management can trust your staff to know that they're going to follow the processes that have been put in place to be compliant with these rules and regulations. Now, ethics, on the other hand, can be a little bit more gray. It's not as clear-cut and defined as laws and rules and regulations are. They're more so about your individual morals and what you're going to adopt as a company for your own ethical groundwork that you're going to build for your company, for your staff. And that will ultimately reflect in how you treat those referral sources, how you treat your patients, and how you interact with outside entities. And so what your individual ethics and morals as a company will be, again, will be determined individually within your own company. What are the morals and ethics that are important to you that you want to convey to the outside world about your company? And that's ultimately going to drive everybody in regards to compliance as well. Those things go hand in hand. Having a high moral integrity is going to encourage everyone to be compliant and to follow those processes and to follow those rules. And it all comes full circle. So these things not only work hand in hand, but they also benefit everybody as a whole. And it may seem daunting developing and implementing these compliance programs, but they impact absolutely everything that we do. And that's why they're so incredibly important. And these are the things, this is the foundation that we lay so that when fraud, waste, and abuse comes up, we can identify it and we can report it so that we can all be held accountable and make sure that we are operating under that high moral integrity to maintain and fulfill those high ethics and to be compliant with those rules and regulations. So let's talk about identifying and reporting fraud, waste, and abuse. So first, we need to be able to identify it. So let's talk about fraud, waste, and abuse, what exactly they each are, how they differ, and also some examples of what they might look like in the workplace so that you can more easily identify them. Now, we tend to use fraud, waste, and abuse quite interchangeably in the industry. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but knowing the difference can be really helpful and really important. And ultimately, when it comes down to the actual reporting of fraud, waste, or abuse, whomever you're reporting that activity to, they don't really care whether or not you correctly identify it as fraud or waste or abuse. They just care that this inappropriate activity is being reported so they can follow up and research and respond to it in a timely and appropriate manner. So don't get too hung up on the details of the differences. Yes, it's important to know the differences, but that's not going to make a huge difference when it comes time to actually report such activity. So first and foremost, we'll talk about fraud. Here we have a pretty basic definition of what exactly fraud is. But the biggest thing to know about fraud is really about intention. Fraud is primarily knowing what you're doing is wrong and choosing to do it anyways. It's that intentional choice that you make to do something that is non-compliant. And so that's the big differentiating factor between fraud and then waste and abuse, that we'll talk about here shortly. Some examples of what fraud might look like in our industry in the workplace include billing for services or supplies that weren't actually provided, whether they weren't provided at all or you're billing a higher number than what was actually provided. Altering claims to obtain higher payments. It could be like upcoding, providing, a higher reimbursed code than what was actually dispensed to the patient. Soliciting or offering receiving of kickbacks, bribes, that all falls under the Stark Law. So making sure you want to be compliant with how you are obtaining those referrals from your referral sources. And then not only internally, but it can also occur within your patients, within your beneficiaries. If they are using another person's Medicare card or another person's insurance card and they are not a beneficiary under that plan. I've seen it frequently in the past. Well, I shouldn't say frequently, but I have seen it in the past in situations where a patient believes that they have Medicare benefits under their spouse and they don't have their own card, so they just present you with their spouse's card. Well, that's not exactly, yes, they could have benefits under their spouse's, under their spouse, but they will have their own card, they will have their own number. And so making sure that they present you with an appropriate card for their own unique benefits is critical. And they could be a simple ignorance and it could be intentional fraud. So providing education in those circumstances so they understand what they're doing is not appropriate. So next is waste. Waste is it's not necessarily intentional. As you can see, it's thoughtless or careless expenditure of resources. And so that's going to be, again, not typically intentional. It's more ignorance, really, or it's not realizing that what you're doing is inappropriate or wasteful or a form of fraud. And so some examples of waste that we might see in the industry, including dispensing or billing for items that aren't technically medically necessary. Maybe they don't meet the full coverage criteria requirements for that item. Or one thing that we hear of commonly in the industry is auto shipping of refills on supplies. So if you're billing for prosthetic supplies, or on the DME side, it's diabetic supplies or catheters or something like that, and just auto shipping supplies monthly, quarterly, whatever the case may be, without actually having a conversation with the patient to confirm that they do in fact need those supplies. That would be a common example of waste in our industry. Just automatically sending the patient new liners or new shrinkers or new socks would not be appropriate. You want to make sure you have a conversation with the patient first to verify that they do in fact need those items before they're sent to the patient. So next up, we have abuse. Abuse, again, is not always intentional. It can be, but it's not always intentional. And it's really about providing services or equipment that might be covered under some instances, but is not always considered appropriate, or it might go against common best practices within the industry. And so it's about being really intentional and knowledgeable about the circumstances under which such items would in fact be payable or would in fact be covered, and making sure that everything is compliant in order to appropriately bill for it. Not just the documentation, all of the coverage criteria, how the claim is billed, verification of benefits, all of those processes are adequately followed consistently in order to be fully compliant and avoid these instances of abuse. Now, some of those examples could include excessive charges for services or supplies, improper billing practices. Again, it could be an ignorance thing. You're billing because this is what you were taught and this is how you've always known it to be, but that might not actually be correct under those payers' requirements. Breach of Medicare or other payers' participation agreement. If you've got a contract with that payer and you violate that contract in some way in order to either receive payment for something you shouldn't or receive a higher payment for something that's not necessarily owed to you. So again, the differences, although there are differences between these three categories as far as fraud, waste, and abuse are concerned, when it comes to the point of actually needing to report it, it's not necessarily critical for you to be able to specifically pinpoint, oh, well, what I saw was a form of waste or if it was a form of abuse. That's not necessarily as critical. What's important is being able to identify what you've seen as a form of fraud, waste, or abuse. It's essentially wrong, not ethical, not compliant, and knowing what to do as far as reporting that information and what you can do about it. Now, first and foremost, if you already have an internal process for reporting fraud, waste, and abuse within your business, like a formal compliance program, please follow that internal process. If you've got a compliance officer that you're supposed to report to or a member of management, please follow that internal process. It's likely there for a reason. So I encourage you to follow that process. If you don't have such a process or you don't have a compliance officer, you can easily report this information to a member of management or the owner of the company, and they can handle it in whatever way they deem fit. Or if your concern is actually with a member of management or the owner, there are other external ways that you can report fraud, waste, and abuse. If it is payer or patient specific as well, those things can be reported directly to that payer for further investigation. So I encourage you to head out to that payer's website, or you can call if they've got a contact center of some sort. You can contact them that way, and they typically will be able to guide you through a process in order to report potential fraud, waste, and abuse. Medicare and Medicaid, they can be reported a few different ways. You can call their contact center to report fraud, waste, and abuse. If it's patient specific for Medicare, you can call 1-800-MEDICARE to report the patient directly. You can also report all of Medicare and Medicaid, and a lot of your Medicaid supplement or Medicaid Advantage or Medicare Advantage plans, replacement plans. Those can all be reported to the OIG as well. And that's kind of the general reference that I give for reporting fraud, waste, and abuse. I strongly recommend going directly to the OIG because depending on the degree and the severity of the fraud, waste, and abuse, most likely a lot of these reports are going to funnel up to the OIG anyways. And so it wouldn't be inappropriate for you to go directly to the source, directly to the OIG website, the Office of Inspector General, and you can submit a report or a complaint right on their website. It guides you through a document. You can fill out all the fields. Again, it's not critical that you be able to identify if what you're witnessing is fraud, waste, or abuse, but as long as you know what you're seeing is wrong. And then provide as much information as possible. Again, if it's payer specific, include that information. If it's patient or claim specific, incorporate as much of that information as possible. Typically, these online submissions will either prompt you for that patient-specific information if it's applicable, or they'll ask you just to hold off on that information and they'll follow up for PHI information after the fact if it's necessary so they can research it appropriately and follow up. Now, one thing I hear often from people who bring these issues to me or bring these concerns to me about potential fraud, waste, and abuse, like, well, what's the point in reporting it if they're not going to do anything? Well, one, they're not going to follow up with you to tell you whether or not they're going to take any action. You've done your job in reporting the potential fraud, waste, and abuse. They will rarely follow up with you unless they need additional information from you. They're not just going to follow up to tell you what, if any, action they're going to take. And just like with any other kind of justice type thing, those wheels move very, very slowly. It takes time for them to research and investigate that report, for them to gather sufficient evidence and data to support that complaint of fraud, waste, and abuse. And so these things take time. And a lot of times they want to gather enough evidence to show a pattern of fraud, waste, and abuse. And the majority of the time, depending on the degree of the infraction, a lot of times the goal is to provide education and allow that person or company or entity to take corrective action and fix that issue and show that they're not going to be making that same mistake again in the future, to which maybe legal action won't even be taken. There could be fines, there could not be, it just depends on the circumstances. We see instances in the media where sometimes it is on a grand scale that the FBI gets involved and there is significant legal action taken. We saw that a few years back with the OIG and the FBI with Operation Brace Yourself, where multiple O&P suppliers and multiple physicians were involved in an operation to basically drop ship off-the-shelf orthoses to patients for whom they didn't have compliant medical records to support justification for those items, to the tune of over $1 billion. And that's kind of the extreme end of the fraud, waste, and abuse spectrum that we see. That's not going to be the case with every report of fraud, waste, and abuse. But if you don't report it, no action can be taken. So if you legitimately believe that what you're seeing is potentially fraud, waste, and abuse, and you don't have an internal process for reporting that within your company, this is definitely an option. You can submit that claim directly to the OIG, and they can take any necessary action to investigate that and address it and proceed as they see fit based on the scope of that infraction. And so again, I encourage you to utilize those sources if you see fit. But companies, if you don't already have a compliance process in place, I strongly urge you to develop one. So that way your staff knows what is expected of them when and if identification of fraud, waste, and abuse occurs. Not everything is going to be worthy of submitting a complaint to the OIG. It might just be a matter of documenting what transpired, providing education to correct the behavior, and documenting the results of that to show that you've taken that necessary action and the processes that you've put in place to prevent it from happening in the future. So just adopting those processes and again, creating that culture of trust so that your staff feels safe and confident to bring those concerns to you when and if those situations arise. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and take any questions that you have about ethics or compliance or the fraud, waste, and abuse that we've discussed here today. What questions do you have for us before we're done?
Yeah, and if you all could just, if you have a question, just pop it into the meeting chat. We can get those addressed. We'll give people 1 more minute or so, and then we can.
Sure.
All right, I am not seeing any questions, so I think we can say that thank you to everyone for joining us today. Hope everybody is planning on joining some of the other sessions we have this week. I will pop the link in the chat that has the link to those to register for those if you're not already. Otherwise, we will hopefully see people the rest of the week. Thank you, Michelle, so much for your time. We appreciate it and hope everybody has a good rest of their Monday.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Okay.